It was supposed to be just another uneventful night alone. I had spent a lot of nights by myself without the ever-watchful eye of my parents. Being only 15, some people might consider that neglect, while others may just think it's unimpressive. A good friend of mine would often brag about staying home alone frequently at an early age. It wasn't as impressive when I found out that his single mother worked 2 jobs to support him. It was quite sad, actually. Ironically, another friend of mine who was 2 years older than me tells me he's not even allowed to go outside after 8 p.m., let alone stay at the house by himself. I, on the other hand, have carefully crafted a trust between my parents. I never begged nor pleaded that I was mature enough to be left alone. I just did what I was told, and eventually, the opportunity presented itself. My dad had come to me one night when I was 13 to tell me that him and Mom were going out to see a movie. They had attempted to find a babysitter but were unsuccessful. So instead, they asked me if I would be alright with staying home alone for a few hours. I shrugged nonchalantly, trying to act as aloof as possible. I told him I'd be fine and that I'd just play some video games and go to bed. My father reminded me about my homework, to which I groaned an agreement. They left, and I nearly lost myself in the excitement. I know it may not sound that thrilling, but I'm sure a lot of people remember the first night they got to stay home alone. I ran around my house causing a ruckus for about 15 minutes. Then, the reality and boredom set in. I retired to my bedroom and played video games most of the night. Around 10 minutes before they returned, I hastily scribbled some answers on my homework and dove into bed trying to force myself to sleep. I heard them open the door to check in on me before slowly closing it. After that night, being left home alone lost its glamour. Don't get me wrong, every time it happened was a welcome event. I could watch movies my parents didn't quite agree with. I could play video games endlessly. And the fridge was a smorgasbord of snacks. So long as I didn't make a mess in the kitchen and didn't set the house on fire, everything would be fine. But that brings me to last night. My parents were both heading out of town to visit my aunt and uncle, probably my least favorite people on the planet. They were awful, and I loathed going there. Every time my parents would make me, I would have to endure my aunt lecturing me on her plethora of rules, while my uncle would just berate me. I once walked out of the bathroom at their house and had forgotten to tuck my shirt in. My aunt snatched me up by the collar and shouted clothing etiquette in her house. My uncle just likes to make jokes about my appearance or intelligence. The phrase, "dumbass kid," has been uttered on more than one occasion. These instances only seem to happen when my parents weren't nearby. Trust me, I've complained to my parents about them, yet they would just tell me that my aunt is very particular about her house, and that my uncle lost his filter in the war. So, when my parents were preparing to leave, my mother said the magic words I wanted to hear. "You don't have to come if you don't want to." I feigned disappointment when she said it, but inside I was an explosion of happiness. During their packing, they gave me the rundown on everything I needed to know. They put all the emergency numbers on the fridge, including their own. They left me $40 to order pizza over the weekend. Then, they warned me that if I do anything wrong, that I'll reap the consequences. As I stood there on the porch watching them drive away, I felt a twinge of remorse for not going with them, but the thought of my aunt's screaming face quickly diminished it. I headed back inside and fell onto the couch in the living room. I laid there for an hour or so, changing the channel on the TV every so often. After an hour of mindlessly frying my brain, I heard a knock on the front door. This jolted me out of my daze, and I quickly turned off the TV like I had been doing something wrong. When my senses came back to me, I got up and walked over to the door. I didn't think we were expecting anyone, so I was hesitant. I slowly turned the knob to the door and cracked it open. Nobody was there. I opened the door a bit further and saw a delivery package sitting on the porch. Those delivery guys are like ninjas, I swear. I laughed off my nerves and brought the package inside. When I set the box down on the counter, I noticed something strange. The TV in the living room was on, though I was positive I had shut it off when I first heard the knock. I turned off the TV once again and went into my bedroom to play some video games. It seemed like I had only been playing for 20 minutes, but when I looked at the clock, nearly 4 hours had passed. The sun had long since set, and I rubbed my tired eyes. When I took my headset off is when I first heard a new noise. It sounded like a rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere, though I couldn't determine the location. I thought it was a leaky pipe somewhere in the house. I got up and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water before heading to bed. I looked around the darkened living room while I sipped my water. I'm not sure if it was just the lack of light or my growing fatigue, but the room felt ominous. The whole house did, in fact. I quickly finished in the kitchen and walked briskly back to my bedroom. After changing and getting into bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I just laid in the darkness, listening to that phantom tapping. A few minutes later, I started to notice something about that tapping noise. The sound was moving. It was faintly echoing from my living room and moving down the hall towards my bedroom. I couldn't be certain, but that's what it sounded like to me. My nerves came back as I laid on my side watching my door. I half expected something to burst in and attack me just then, but nothing did. Only the tapping persisted. An hour ticked by, and the tapping started to move again. By this point, I was certain it wasn't just a leaky pipe. The tapping followed along my wall, up onto my ceiling, before stopping directly above my head. I felt my throat tighten as I stared at my ceiling without blinking. Then, I saw something begin to take shape above me. I know this all sounds strange, but trust me, I'm not entirely sure how to explain this. I watched as a hand began to push its way through my ceiling. It wasn't like something was in the attic clawing its way through the wood and drywall. No, it was like something from another dimension was now entering my room. The fingers pushed through first, followed by a hand. The pale skin was almost indistinguishable from the white paint which coated my ceiling. An arm followed next. Then, a few inches away, another hand appeared. The hands and arms dangled lifelessly from my ceiling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then, what appeared to be black strings began to poke through in between the two arms. It was hair. Slowly, the hair grew closer to me as I stared in disbelief. Then a head began to take shape. The head was facing away from me, so I couldn't see its face right away, only more black hair. Then the shoulders formed until half of its body was now dangling from my ceiling to just above my head. The body twitched slightly, like an electric current was jolting through it. Slowly, the body began to bend backwards, and the head lifted up to face me. A gasping, wheezing sound filled my previously silent room. That's when I saw her face. She looked like a woman in her early 20s, maybe. Her eyes were glassy and vacant, yet somehow, I knew she was still staring directly at me. But what terrified me most about this woman hanging from my ceiling was her mouth. She was completely missing her lower jaw. Her tongue dangled near her face as viscera coated the remnants of her mouth. She wheezed as she stared at me, her arms growing closer and closer. I wanted to scream, but at the same time, I didn't want to move for fear I would induce a reaction out of her. Her hands reached my face. Her fingers felt like icicles against my skin. I instinctively shut my eyes, praying this whole thing was just some horrific nightmare. She forced her frigid fingers into my mouth and attempted to pry my jaw open. Suddenly, I felt my senses come back to me and I screamed, swinging at the creature wildly. I flailed frantically and rolled out of my bed. I dashed out of my bedroom, down the hall, and called my parents immediately. My mom was understandably upset when I called her, but I didn't know what else to do. I told her that I was having a pretty messed up nightmare and asked her to stay on the phone with me while I went to check my room. The woman was gone, and so was that ominous feeling I had felt previously. My mother tiredly told me they would be home tomorrow night and told me to go back to bed. I thanked her for answering, but after I hung up with her, I didn't go to sleep. I stayed up all night watching TV in the living room with all the lights on. I'm not sure what or who that was or why it even targeted me. Maybe it was just looking for someone who was all alone and decided that I was an easy target. Maybe it was just an extremely vivid nightmare. I don't know. But I think the next time my parents decide to go out of town, I'll be going with them as well.